was a Friday night when the three friends, Tom, Sarah, and Michael, decided to sneak into their high school. The school was quiet and the corridors were dark, lit only by faint emergency lights. They weren't looking for trouble, just some excitement. The idea of exploring the empty school at night had seemed thrilling earlier in the day. Tom led the way as they quietly walked through the long, deserted hallway. Their footsteps echoed softly on the tiled floor. Sarah and Michael followed closely, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting to be caught at any moment. They reached the science wing, a part of the school that always felt eerie, even during the day. At night, it was worse. The shadows seemed deeper, and the air colder. Tom, always the boldest of the group, suggested they check out the biology lab. The door creaked as they opened it, and they stepped inside. It was pitch black, except for the small beams from their phone flashlights. The lab was filled with the usual desks, equipment, and cabinets. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the atmosphere was thick with tension. After a few minutes of walking around, Sarah suggested they leave. She was getting a strange feeling, as if someone, or something, was watching them. But Tom wanted to keep exploring. Michael, trying to be brave, sided with Tom. They moved to the back of the lab, where old storage cabinets lined the wall. Tom, ever curious, pulled open one of the cabinets. It was empty, except for a few dusty jars and papers. Sarah sighed in relief, ready to head out. But as they turned to leave, the door to the lab slammed shut behind them. Michael jumped and aimed his flashlight at the door. "It's just the wind," Tom muttered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The air in the room felt colder now, and the sound of their breathing seemed louder in the silence. Sarah moved toward the door to open it, but it wouldn't budge. She pushed and pulled, but the handle was stuck. "This isn't funny," she said, panic creeping into her voice. Michael joined her, trying to force the door open, but it wouldn't move an inch. Tom scanned the room with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "There must be another way out," he said, though he wasn't sure. The windows were sealed tight, and the door was their only exit. Suddenly they heard a noise from the back of the room, a soft scraping sound. They froze, all three turning their lights in the direction of the sound. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, as if something was dragging itself across the floor. "Who's there?" Tom called, but there was no answer. The scraping grew louder. It seemed to be coming from the farthest corner, behind one of the cabinets. Michael, swallowing his fear, stepped toward it. Sarah grabbed his arm, whispering for him to stay back, but he shook her off. He couldn't let Tom think he was scared. As Michael approached the corner, his light flickered for a second, casting strange shadows on the walls. The scraping stopped. He stood still, his breath quick and shallow. Tom and Sarah stood frozen, watching him. Then, without warning, the scraping noise returned, louder this time. Michael spun around, his flashlight flickering wildly. But in the next moment, the light went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. "Michael!" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling. She fumbled with her phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but her hands were shaking. Tom called out for Michael too, but there was no response. The silence was deafening, broken only by their ragged breathing. Sarah's flashlight finally flickered back to life, and she pointed it where Michael had been standing. But he was gone. The corner was empty, the cabinet untouched. There was no sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there. "Michael!" Sarah screamed again, running to the spot where he had disappeared. Tom grabbed her, trying to pull her back, but she was frantic. "We need to find him!" she cried. But the room was still, and the scraping sound had stopped. The door, still locked, showed no sign of opening, and Michael was gone without a trace. They searched for him, calling his name over and over, but there was no answer. The lab was empty, and the cold silence swallowed their voices. Tom finally stopped, realizing that whatever had happened to Michael wasn't something they could explain. They eventually escaped the lab, but Michael was never found. The school was searched, the police were called, but there was no sign of him. To this day, Tom and Sarah don't talk about that night. They never went back to the science wing, and they never told anyone exactly what happened in that room. But they both know that whatever took Michael is still waiting in the dark, somewhere in that school. For over 20 years, I've captained the Siren's Call, a resilient trawler weathered by time but steadfast through countless tempests. My existence is interwoven with the sea. Its rhythms shape my daily existence, and its enigmas fuel my nocturnal visions. Tonight, however, the ocean murmurs secrets more arcane than any I've encountered before. As twilight descends, I navigate into familiar waters, the heavens a canvas of crimson as the sun retreats beneath the horizon. The radio emits sporadic warnings of impending turbulent seas, yet the evening is peculiarly calm, the water like glass mirroring the nascent stars. It is then I first hear it, a whisper so delicate, I dismiss it as the sea sighing through the time-worn hull. I attempt to disregard the sounds, focusing instead on inspecting the nets and gear, but the whisper evolves, becoming a persistent chant that sounds almost like a supplication. Discomfort tingles through me, the boundless sea suddenly claustrophobic. Peering into the growing darkness, I see nothing but the advancing night. The true shock comes when I retrieve the nets. It's not the abundance of the catch that halts my heart, but rather an object ensnared among the fish. A mermaid statue crafted from dark, marbled stone, intricately detailed and unnervingly lifelike. Her eyes, nearly shut, seem to quiver under the lantern's glow, her lips forever mouthing a silent plea. Instinct screams at me to cast it back into the abyss, to erase its memory from my mind, but I am ensnared by its beauty. I clear away the scales from her visage, and the whispers amplify, now distinct utterances in an unknown tongue. The air cools, my breath visible, and the ocean stirs uneasily. I secure the statue in my cabin and try to steady my nerves with a cup of coffee, though sleep evades me. The whispers invade the walls, infiltrating my thoughts, an omnipresent murmur. At the stroke of midnight, I step outside. The moon casts a wan light overhead. The sea has darkened, its waves caressing the hull with frosty fingers. Beneath, shapes move deliberately, encircling the vessel, not mere reflections or marine life, but something more sinister. Spectral figures, their forms indistinct and mutable. They gaze upon me, their eyes voids filled with despair and yearning. I hasten back to the cabin, pulse racing, just as the engine falters and dies. The radio offers only static, my pleas for aid lost in the emptiness. The vessel drifts, seized by a current that seems sentient, intentful. Dawn discovers me drained, the shoreline out of sight. The ocean appears to have claimed me. With determination, I don my diving gear. The whispers reach a crescendo as I near the water, the statue's call irrefutable. In the frigid, murky depths, I am not solitary. Figures glide around me, their caresses icy, their murmurs now imploring. I locate the statue resting on the seabed amid stones. Clasping it, I ascend towards the surface, their lamentations trailing me. Breaking the surface, the sunlight welcomes me, stark against the gloom below. The engine springs to life at my touch, the spectral figures withdrawing into the abyss. With the statue aboard, I chart a course for home. The whispers at last stilled. I abandon the statue on the shore, concealed among stones and driftwood. As I venture back into the open sea, the horizon vast and expectant, I recognize that the sea has marked me indelibly. It's intertwined with my being, as I am with it, bound by whispers and under the watch of unseen entities. Though I return to the maritime expanses, I am forever haunted by that night when the ocean conversed, and the reverberations of those whispers persist, eternally resonating in the depths. As I continue my voyages, the memory of that night lingers, a haunting melody of the deep that I can neither escape nor ignore. Each wave that breaks against the hull seems to carry a fragment of that eerie serenade, reminding me that the sea, with all its beauty and terror, holds secrets man was perhaps never meant to unearth. Yet here I am, drawn back to its vast, whispering expanse, forever changed, perpetually aware that my tale has become part of the ocean's mysterious lore. Miller Farm had been in the family for generations. The sprawling fields, the weathered barns, and the old farmhouse stood as a testament to years of hard work and toil. But now, it was a shadow of its former self. The fields lay barren, and the barns were crumbling. The only constant was the massive rusted tractor, sitting unused in the middle of the farm. It hadn't been moved in years, its hulking frame a reminder of better times. John Miller had taken over the farm from his father, and though times were tough, he did his best to keep the place running. His son, Tommy, was fascinated by the tractor. At 8 years old, Tommy's curiosity often led him to places he wasn't supposed to go. His father had warned him many times to stay away from the old machine. It was dangerous, its parts rusted and its gears broken. But like most young boys, the allure of something forbidden was too tempting. One hot summer afternoon, John was working in the barn, trying to fix a broken fence, while Tommy played nearby. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the farm. The air was thick with the smell of dust and hay. John wiped the sweat from his brow, unaware that Tommy had wandered off. Tommy's footsteps were light as he approached the rusted tractor. Its once vibrant green paint had long since faded, replaced by patches of rust and grime. The seat was covered in dirt, and the large wheels were half buried in the ground. But to Tommy, it was still a marvel. He climbed up onto the seat, pretending to drive, his small hands gripping the cold metal steering wheel. As he played, Tommy noticed something glinting beneath the tractor. Curious, he jumped down and crawled underneath to get a better look. It was a wrench, probably left there by his grandfather years ago. As he reached for it, the tractor creaked, its rusted metal groaning under its own weight. Suddenly, the tractor shifted. The heavy machinery, unused for years, began to move. The front end dipped down, and before Tommy could react, he was pinned beneath the enormous weight. The sharp edge of the metal dug into his small frame, and he screamed out in pain. John heard the scream, his heart stopping in his chest. He dropped his tools and ran toward the sound, his mind racing with fear. As he rounded the corner, he saw it. The tractor had shifted, and Tommy was trapped underneath. John's legs gave out, but he forced himself to move. He reached the tractor and tried to lift it, his hands slipping on the rusted metal. Tommy's eyes were wide with terror, his small voice weak as he called for his father. John pulled with all his might, but the machine wouldn't budge. Frantic, John ran back to the barn to grab a crowbar. But when he returned, Tommy had stopped crying. His small body was still, his eyes closed. John fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. The sun had set, and the farm was cloaked in darkness. The only sound was the soft rustle of the wind through the fields, as if the land itself was mourning. The next day, the neighbors found John sitting next to the tractor, staring blankly ahead. Tommy's body had already been taken away, but John couldn't bring himself to leave. The guilt consumed him. He should have watched his son more closely, should have warned him more sternly. But now, it was too late. The Miller farm was never the same after that. John stopped working the land, and the fields grew wild. The tractor, still rusted and unmoved, sat in the same spot, its presence a constant reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. Years passed, and the story of Tommy's death became legend. The new owners of the farm often spoke of strange occurrences near the tractor, shadows moving where there shouldn't be, the sound of a child's laughter carried on the wind, and on quiet nights, the faint creaking of rusted metal. Some said that Tommy's spirit never left the farm, forever trapped by the machine that had taken his life. Others believed it was just a sad reminder of the dangers that lurked in forgotten places. But one thing was certain. The rusted tractor would forever be a symbol of loss, and the land around it would never truly be at peace. The Mariner's Promise was a vessel as sturdy and reliable as any seasoned sailor could hope for. I had captained her through storms and calm, under scorching suns and amidst biting frosts, always sure of her strength. Yet, as we set out that fateful morning, there was a tension in the air, an uneasy calm that seemed to whisper of impending doom. My crew, A hardened bunch of lifelong fishermen joked about the eerie quiet of the sea as we cast our nets under a cloudless sky. The sea was mirror-like, unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. It was midday when the first sign of trouble flickered on the horizon, a thin, misty fog that seemed to materialize from nowhere. "Squall coming," muttered old Pete, the eldest among us, his eyes narrowing at the advancing mist. But it was no squall. As the fog enveloped us, the temperature dropped sharply, and a palpable sense of dread settled over the mariner's promise. The compass spun wildly, navigation equipment failing one by one, leaving us blind in the creeping whiteness. Then, the voices started. Soft at first, they murmured just below the threshold of understanding, rising and falling with the gentle swell of the sea. The crew grew silent, each man straining to decipher the sounds that seemed to come from the ocean itself. "It's calling to us," whispered Joey, a rookie who'd never seen the like. He was right. The sea was calling, its voice a melodic lure that was both beautiful and terrifying. As night fell, the voices grew into a chorus, an ethereal song that promised secrets of the deep, urging us closer to the water's edge. Some among the crew, drawn by the haunting melody, leaned too close. I grabbed Joey as his foot slipped over the rail, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and longing. "We need to get out of this fog," I declared, my voice barely carrying over the now deafening song, but the sea had other plans. A sudden, monstrous wave rose from the calm, a towering wall of water charged with the energy of the depths. It struck with the force of an enraged leviathan, tipping the mariner's promise as if she were no more than a toy. Water flooded the deck, chaos erupting as men scrambled for life vests and rafts. Another wave hit, and I was thrown into the frigid embrace of the sea, the voices crescendoing around me. By some miracle, I surfaced, gasping for air, clutching at a piece of debris. Around me, the fog was dissipating, revealing the first light of dawn. But of the mariner's promise and my crew, there was no sign. She had vanished, swallowed by the sea and its song. Rescue came hours later, but the mystery remained unsolved. The sea had claimed the mariner's promise, leaving only a survivor to tell her tale, a tale of voices in the fog and a song that called us to the depths. I spent many nights afterward haunted by the loss, the sounds of the sea's song lingering in my ears. Questions plagued my waking hours and invaded my dreams. Had the sea been guarding some ancient secret, or was it merely the play of nature, as cruel and arbitrary as it was beautiful? Months turned into years, and the story of the mariner's promise became a whispered legend among seafaring folk, a tale told to warn of the ocean's treacherous beauty. Despite the tragedy, the sea continued to call to me, its vast mystery a siren song I could not ignore. I knew I would return to the waters one day, perhaps to confront the same voices that had ensnared my crew, or to lay to rest the ghosts that had followed me ashore. As I prepared for another voyage, equipped with a new crew and a sturdier ship, the echoes of that day resonated deep within me. We would sail under a clear sky, vigilant and respectful of the ocean's power, ready to face whatever mysteries lay beneath its surface. Whether it was folly or fate that drew me back, I could not say. But the sea had marked me, and I was bound to answer its call, come what may. Jake had inherited the old farm after his grandfather passed away. It was a sprawling, isolated property, far from the town. The nearest neighbor was a good 2 miles away, and the land was surrounded by dense woods. The old farmhouse stood in the middle of the fields, its paint peeling and the windows covered in dust. The barns were worn down, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden walls. Despite its neglected state, Jake had decided to stay for a while, to fix it up and perhaps sell it later. His first night there was quiet, almost too quiet. The wind outside seemed to die down the moment the sun set, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against the walls of the farmhouse. Jake sat in the living room, sipping coffee, the only sound being the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. The silence was thick, unnerving even. Around midnight, as Jake lay in bed, something woke him. A faint sound, distant but clear, coming from outside. He listened carefully, straining to hear through the thick walls. It was a soft tapping sound, rhythmic, like footsteps. It stopped suddenly, and Jake shook it off, convincing himself it was probably the wind. The next morning, he explored the farm, taking a look at the barns and the old equipment. One of the barns, larger than the others, was locked shut. Jake found the key in the house and opened it, revealing old farming tools and equipment covered in dust. But something felt off. The air inside the barn was stale, almost too still. He decided not to linger. The second night was worse. The same sound woke him again, soft footsteps, but this time, closer. Jake sat up in bed, his heart racing. The sound was coming from the front porch. He crept out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and peeked through the window. There was no one there, just the moonlight casting long shadows across the empty field. By the third night, Jake was on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the farm, that something was watching him. He kept his flashlight by the bed and a heavy wrench on the floor, just in case. The footsteps came again, louder this time, moving from the front porch to the side of the house. Jake grabbed the flashlight and ran to the window, shining the beam outside. There was nothing, just the empty yard and the dark barns in the distance. As the days passed, Jake found himself growing more paranoid. The once quiet, peaceful fields now felt ominous. During the day, he would catch glimpses of movement in the woods at the edge of the property, but when he looked closer, there was nothing there. The barn that he had unlocked felt like it was hiding something, its stillness oppressive. The last night on the farm, Jake had enough. The footsteps were louder, now circling the house. He bolted out of bed, wrench in hand, and threw open the door, ready to confront whatever or whoever was out there. The cold night air hit him as he stood on the porch, the moon casting eerie shadows across the yard. But there was nothing, only silence. Then, from the barn, he heard it. A low, deep creaking, like something heavy moving inside. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew he had locked the barn after his last visit, and yet, the door was slightly ajar. Slowly, he approached the barn, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees as he reached for the door. Inside, the barn was dark, the faint moonlight barely illuminating the old equipment. The air was thick, almost suffocating. Jake stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him with a loud bang, the sound echoing through the empty space. Jake spun around, his flashlight flickering as he tried to see what had closed the door. From the back of the barn, a shadow moved. Jake froze, the beam of his flashlight catching the faint outline of something, or someone, standing in the darkness. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It was tall, its face obscured by the shadows, but the presence was undeniable. Jake backed away, his mind racing, but there was nowhere to go. The door was shut, and the figure was closing in, its footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. The wrench in his hand felt useless, the weight of fear paralyzing him. As the figure drew closer, the air grew colder, and the silence in the barn became deafening. Jake's flashlight flickered again, then went out, plunging the barn into complete darkness. The last thing he heard before everything went silent was the sound of slow, deliberate breathing, just inches away from his face. The next morning, the farm was quiet once again, the sun rising over the fields as if nothing had happened. The neighbors found the farmhouse empty, Jake's truck still parked outside. The barn door was locked, just as Jake had left it. No one ever saw Jake again. The highway was deserted, the only sound the monotonous hum of my car's engine as I navigated the dark, winding road. The clock on the dashboard glowed 11:57 p.m., and my eyelids grew heavy with each passing mile. I was desperate for a place to rest when the glow of a neon sign cut through the night's darkness like a beacon. Maple Grove Motel, it announced. Last stop for 100 miles. The choice was made out of sheer necessity. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot of the motel, the neon flickering intermittently, casting eerie shadows. The lobby of the motel was dimly lit and smelled of mildew and old smoke. An elderly man with a gaunt face and wary eyes greeted me from behind a dusty counter. "Just passing through?" he rasped, his voice brittle like dry leaves. "Yes, just need a place to crash for the night," I replied, trying to keep the conversation brief. "Room 8, end of the corridor," he said, handing me a brass key that felt unusually cold in my palm. "It's quiet there. You'll find peace," he added, an odd, lingering smile on his face as he spoke. The room was a relic of the past, decorated with outdated floral wallpaper and a heavy, dark wood dresser. The bed squeaked under my weight as I sat down, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. Despite the heater's best efforts, a persistent draft chilled the room, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. As I settled into bed, a soft whisper broke the silence. My name floated through the air, a sigh that seemed to come from within the walls. "Come out," it beckoned, chilling me to the bone. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, a byproduct of my exhaustion, but then it came again, louder, more desperate. Driven by a mixture of fear and intrigue, I left my room, the hallway stretching ominously before me. The carpet was threadbare and damp underfoot as I followed the whispers to room 5, where the door stood slightly open, inviting yet foreboding. Inside, darkness enveloped me, the kind of darkness so deep it felt tangible. My hand searched along the icy wall for a light switch but found nothing. Instead, my fingers traced over what felt like old, torn wallpaper. The air was heavy, laced with the scent of iron and mold, suffocating in its intensity. A sudden sob from the bathroom snapped my attention to the ajar door, where a sliver of light promised some visibility. Approaching cautiously, the mirror revealed itself through the dimness, fogged up despite the cold. Words appeared on the surface, scrawled as if by an unseen hand. "Help us leave." The temperature plummeted, my breath visible in the air as I stumbled back, heart pounding. Whispers swirled around, a cacophony of voices that seemed both distant and painfully close. "Free us!" they pleaded. Trapped and desperate, I searched the room for an exit, but found the layout inexplicably altered. Doors disappeared, replaced by walls that seemed to close in around me. It felt like hours before the room returned to its original form, the door reappearing as if it had never vanished. Exhausted and terrified, I fled back to my room, grabbing my belongings without a second glance. As I rushed out of the motel, the old man was nowhere to be seen, replaced by the morning clerk who seemed completely unaware of the motel's nocturnal anomalies. The drive away from Maple Grove was silent, the dawn light doing little to warm the cold fear that had settled in my bones. The whispers occasionally echoed in my ears, a grim reminder of the night's terror. I knew I would never stop at that lonely stretch of road again, and the whispers, though faint, seemed to follow me long into the daylight. The school was deserted, its halls filled with an eerie silence. Mr. Benson had been assigned the night watch for the exam period, a task he had reluctantly accepted. The building always felt different after dark, too quiet, too still. But it was just one night. By morning, it would all be over. He started his rounds, his footsteps echoing faintly in the long, dark hallways. The faint glow of emergency lights barely illuminated his path. As he passed by the gym, he heard a faint creak. He paused, straining to listen, but there was nothing else. Just the normal sounds of an old building. He shook it off, telling himself it was nothing. Mr. Benson continued through the science wing. The air felt colder here, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. His flashlight flickered briefly, but it remained steady enough to push through his growing unease. As he moved past a row of classrooms, something caught his eye. Movement at the far end of the hall, near the old storage room. He stopped, aiming his flashlight down the hallway. Nothing moved. Yet the uneasy feeling persisted. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he took a few cautious steps forward, peering into the darkness. The faint glow of the light barely penetrated the gloom, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw something shift in the corner of his vision. Suddenly, A door slammed shut behind him, the noise exploding in the quiet hallway. He spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing. His breath came faster as he shone his flashlight in every direction, trying to calm himself. The shadows danced, but the hallway was empty. He rushed to the stairwell, his footsteps quickening. His hand gripped the cold railing as he descended. But halfway down, a new sound reached his ears. A soft, slow creaking, like something dragging itself across the floor. His heart skipped a beat. He turned his head toward the noise. From the top of the stairs, something dark moved. At first, he couldn't make out what it was, just a shadow sliding across the floor. But then, it began to take form. It wasn't human, just a black, shifting mass, creeping toward him with deliberate slowness. Panic gripped him. Mr. Benson bolted down the stairs, his feet barely touching the steps. His flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams of light. He reached the ground floor, sprinting toward the front doors. His breath was ragged, his chest tight with fear. When he reached the doors, he yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't move. He pulled harder, desperation setting in. But the door was locked tight. He pounded his fists against the door, shouting for help, but his voice echoed uselessly in the empty halls. The sound of something dragging itself along the floor returned. Louder now. Closer. He turned, his back pressed against the door, as the shadowy mass crept down the stairwell. It moved slowly, yet it was relentless, coming toward him like a thick fog. His mind screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The whispers began then, soft, unintelligible, but filled with something dark and malicious. The shadow closed in, just feet away now, and the whispers grew louder, filling his ears, invading his thoughts. His legs trembled as he felt the cold presence wrap around him. The air was thick, suffocating. His vision blurred, and his knees buckled. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the shadow looming over him, the whispers filling his mind, drowning out his thoughts. The next morning, Mr. Benson's body was found near the entrance, eyes wide open in terror. The police could find no sign of forced entry, no clue as to what had happened. But the fear etched into his face told a different story, one that would never be fully understood. From that night on, no one stayed late at the school. Rumors spread about what Mr. Benson had seen, about the shadow that lurked in the empty halls. No one could explain it, but everyone agreed on one thing. Something was still there, waiting in the dark for the next person to be alone at night. I never believed in curses, at least not until it was too late. My name is Jack, and my wife Sarah and I had always imagined a perfect life together. We were young and in love, and after 2 years of dating, we decided to get married. But there was one thing we never talked about with anyone. 2 months before our wedding, Sarah found out she was pregnant. It wasn't planned, but we were excited. It felt like the next chapter of our lives was unfolding earlier than we expected. We decided to keep the pregnancy a secret, thinking we'd announce it after the wedding. But our happiness didn't last. One night, as Sarah was about 8 weeks pregnant, she woke up screaming in pain. We rushed to the hospital, but there was nothing they could do. The doctor told us we had lost the baby. It felt like the world had crumbled beneath us. We had to pretend like nothing had happened, move on with the wedding as if everything was normal. That was when things started to change. Sarah seemed different after the miscarriage. She was quieter, more distant. But I thought it was just the grief. A few weeks after the wedding, she began having strange dreams. Every night she would wake up in a cold sweat, telling me about a woman standing at the foot of our bed, whispering. Sarah could never hear what she was saying, but the woman's face was pale and gaunt, and her eyes were hollow. I tried to comfort her, telling her it was just a nightmare, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The dreams didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Sarah said the woman would get closer to her every night, her whispers growing louder, her face more twisted. One night, I woke to find Sarah standing in the middle of our bedroom, staring at the wall, muttering to herself. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. When I touched her shoulder, she snapped out of it. but she looked at me with eyes I barely recognized. Cold, distant, as if something else was looking through her. Things in the house started to feel wrong. It was small at first, objects moving on their own, strange noises in the night. But soon, we began hearing the crying. It would start just after midnight, faint at first, like a baby's wail coming from far away. It would grow louder, echoing through the house. But when we searched every room, there was nothing there. Sarah started getting sick. She was pale, always exhausted, and no matter what we did, she couldn't seem to shake the feeling of being watched. Then, one night, she woke me up in a panic, clutching her stomach. "She's here," she whispered, her voice shaking. I looked around the room, but it was empty. "Who's here?" I asked, trying to calm her down. "The woman," she said. "She's here for the baby." The next morning, we found a note written in Sarah's handwriting, but she swore she hadn't written it. The message was short, but it sent chills down my spine. The child must be born. We tried to leave the house, but it was as if something wouldn't let us. The more we packed our things, the heavier the air around us became. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching, waiting for something. One night, the crying returned, louder and more insistent than ever before. Sarah's health continued to decline, and I was losing her, little by little, to whatever was haunting us. The crying wouldn't stop. It filled the walls, vibrating through the floor, and I felt like I was going mad. Then, as Sarah lay in bed, too weak to move, I saw her. The woman from Sarah's dreams, standing at the foot of the bed, her hollow eyes fixed on Sarah's stomach. She smiled, a twisted, malevolent smile that chilled me to my core. "Jack," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "She wants the baby back." In that moment, everything became clear. The baby we had lost. It wasn't just gone. It had been taken. The woman, whoever she was, had laid a curse on us. A curse tied to the unborn child we never had the chance to hold. I tried to fight it, but there was nothing I could do. The woman's voice filled the room, a low, guttural chant that shook the very foundations of the house. Sarah screamed as her body convulsed, her hands clutching her stomach in agony. Then, everything went silent. When I looked down, Sarah's breathing had stopped, her eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. The room grew cold, and in the corner, I saw it. A small, shadowy figure. It didn't make a sound, but I knew it was the child we had lost. It stood there, watching, before disappearing into the darkness. The house remains empty now, abandoned. No one will ever understand what happened here, and I can't bring myself to tell anyone. All I know is that the curse is real, and it took everything from me. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the crying. As the manager of Moonlight Motel, I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing prepared me for the night when silence descended like a cloak, suffocating every whisper of the desert wind. It started as an ordinary shift with Jake, our night clerk, reporting for duty. He was a good kid, always on time, never complained, even when dealing with the more troublesome guests. That evening, the air was heavier, tinged with a foreboding that clung to the dimly lit lobby. Jake checked in an elderly couple and a businessman before settling behind the desk, diving into a worn paperback. I retreated to my office, adjacent to the lobby, leaving the door slightly ajar to keep an eye on things. Hours ticked by. The clock's monotonous ticking was a soothing background noise until it stopped abruptly. I looked up, finding the silence unsettling. Stepping out, I saw Jake still in his chair, book face down on the desk. "Hey, Jake," I called, no response. Closer now, something was off. The way he sat, too still, too rigid. Reaching out, I shook his shoulder and he slumped forward, lifeless. Panic seized me as I checked for a pulse, finding none. The room spun and I stumbled back, crashing into a shelf. As I hit the floor, the air grew cold and a whisper crept along the walls, saying, "Leave us." Police arrived, their questions a blur as they cordoned off the area. They suggested a heart attack, but the chill lingering in the air spoke of darker things. After they left, I reviewed the security tapes. The footage showed Jake reading, then pausing, looking up at something off camera, fear etching his face before he returned to his book, moments later slumping over. The next few nights were restless. I heard whispers, saw shadows flitting through the halls. The motel guests complained of cold spots, of feeling watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever took Jake was still here. Maybe had always been. One night, drawn to the lobby, I found the air thick with the same oppressive silence from that night. The whispers were louder now, an urgent, hissing chant. "Join us," they said. I fled to my office, barricading the door until morning. Since then, I've never stayed past sunset at the Moonlight Motel. The day staff handles things now. Jake's chair remains empty, a silent testament to the night when the whispers claimed him. I warn everyone, don't listen to the walls, but it's only a matter of time before curiosity, or something else, draws them in. The old wing of Oakwood High was scheduled for demolition. It was a part of the school no one used anymore, with broken windows and peeling paint. Still, some teachers occasionally held detention there, in a room known as Room 34. It was an odd choice since the room was hidden away in a back corner, far from the main part of the school. One evening, a group of students was sent to detention for skipping class. There were 5 of them, and none seemed particularly concerned. They sat in Room 34, texting and chatting quietly. The teacher in charge of them left to grab some papers, promising to return shortly. Minutes passed, and the students grew bored. One of them, a boy named Sam, wandered around the room. He noticed a strange door at the back of the classroom. It looked old, much older than the rest of the building, and had a rusty handle. Out of curiosity, he tried the handle, but the door didn't budge. "Maybe it leads to an old storage closet," one of the others joked, but Sam wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the door. The minutes turned into an hour, and the teacher still hadn't returned. The students began to get nervous. They tried texting their friends, but there was no signal in this part of the building. When they opened the classroom door to leave, they found the hallway beyond was dark, the lights flickering weakly. Sam suggested they stick together and wait, but the others disagreed. They began wandering down the hallway, hoping to find another way out. Sam stayed behind, standing in the doorway of Room 34. That was when he heard it, the faint sound of whispering. It wasn't coming from the hallway, but from the old door at the back of the room. He turned around and stared at the door. The whispering grew louder, though he couldn't make out any words. His heart pounded in his chest and his hands trembled as he took a step closer. Suddenly, the door swung open on its own, revealing a dark, empty space beyond. Sam screamed for his friends, but when he turned back to the hallway, they were gone. He ran outside, searching for them, but they had disappeared. The police were called, but the students were never found. The only clue left behind was the open door in Room 34, which was later sealed off when the building was demolished. Story 3. The Abandoned Gym. Greenfield High had a large, unused gym that was only open during exams or special events. It was a massive building with tall ceilings, metal bleachers, and dusty old equipment scattered around. The gym hadn't been used for years, but it was still part of the school's property, and sometimes students would sneak in, looking for adventure. One night, 3 students decided to break into the gym. They wanted to explore and take pictures for their social media pages. The school had been abandoned for hours, and it was the perfect time. They climbed through a broken window and found themselves in the middle of the empty gym, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The first few minutes were fun. They laughed, took photos, and dared each other to explore the darker corners. But soon, they noticed something strange. No matter how far they walked, they kept ending up back at the center of the gym. It was as if the space was looping, trapping them in an endless circle. At first, they thought it was just a coincidence, but the longer it went on, the more they realized something was wrong. The gym was cold, much colder than it had been when they first entered. The metal bleachers creaked as if someone was walking on them, but when they turned their flashlights in that direction, they saw nothing. One of the students suggested leaving, But when they tried to find the exit, the door they had come through was gone. In its place was a blank wall. Panic set in as they ran to the other side of the gym, only to find more walls, no doors, no windows, just cold, empty space. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. They couldn't tell. Their flashlights began to flicker, and the sounds of footsteps grew louder, closer. Desperate, they tried breaking through the walls, but it was no use. The gym had swallowed them, and no one ever saw them again. The next morning, the school staff found the gym in its usual state, empty, quiet, with no sign of anyone having been there the night before. But the students' families reported them missing, and despite searches, no trace was ever found. The gym was eventually closed for good, but the stories of what happened there remained, haunting the memories of those who had once played inside its walls. The farm had been abandoned for years, left to decay under the relentless sun and time. No one dared to set foot near it, not since the incident. Sarah had heard the rumors her whole life, whispers about what had happened on the farm's last night of operation. The massive silo, standing tall and rusted in the middle of the property, was said to be cursed. No crops had grown on the land since, and the townspeople avoided it as though it carried a plague. Sarah didn't believe in curses, though. She was a practical person, and the idea of a haunted silo seemed ridiculous. So when her uncle, who had recently bought the land at auction, asked her to help with some basic maintenance before he could sell it, she didn't hesitate. It was just an old farm, nothing more. The air was thick with the smell of dry earth as she pulled up to the farm in her truck. The fields were barren, the once productive land now cracked and dry. In the distance, the towering silo stood like a monument to the past, casting long shadows across the empty landscape. The farmhouse was barely standing, its roof caved in, and the barns looked ready to collapse at any moment. But the silo, it was eerily untouched by the decay around it. Sarah parked her truck and began unloading her tools. The plan was simple. Inspect the silo, make sure it wasn't about to collapse, and check if there were any signs of squatters. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the land, but she wanted to get started before it got dark. As she walked toward the silo, a strange feeling settled over her. The wind had picked up, blowing through the dead crops, and for the first time, Sarah felt uneasy. She shrugged it off, attributing it to nerves. She wasn't used to being alone in such an isolated place. The door to the silo was rusted shut. Sarah cursed under her breath, grabbing her crowbar to pry it open. After several attempts, the door finally gave way with a loud creak, revealing a dark interior. The smell hit her immediately, a foul stench, like something had died inside. She hesitated but pressed forward, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The inside of the silo was cold, much colder than it should have been on a summer evening. The walls were covered in a strange, dark substance that she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't mold, but it looked like something had seeped into the walls over time. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she stepped inside, her boots crunching on the dirt-covered floor. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the silo, causing Sarah to jump. She spun around, her flashlight flickering as she scanned the space. There was nothing. No one. The wind must have slammed the door shut, she told herself, though the uneasy feeling gnawed at her. She continued to explore, her footsteps echoing in the hollow space. There was something strange about the silo. It felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the darkness felt too thick, too suffocating. As she reached the far end of the silo, her flashlight flickered again, the beam barely cutting through the blackness. That's when she heard it. A faint sound, like whispering, coming from the walls. It was low, barely audible at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she froze, listening. The whispers seemed to be saying her name, but that was impossible. She was alone. The cold in the silo grew more intense, and the whispering became a cacophony of voices. Sarah's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she backed away, her flashlight flickering wildly. The dark substance on the walls seemed to pulse, moving as though alive. Without thinking, Sarah bolted for the door, her heart racing as the whispers turned into screams. She slammed into the door, forcing it open and stumbling out into the night. The cold air of the silo was replaced by the dry, warm night, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left her. She sprinted back to her truck, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the keys. As the engine roared to life, Sarah glanced back at the silo, now bathed in moonlight. She could still hear the faint sound of whispers, carried on the wind as she sped away from the farm. The next morning, Sarah's uncle found her at home, pale and shaking. She refused to talk about what had happened, but she begged him to sell the farm, to leave the land to rot. When he went to the farm later that week, the silo door was shut tight, and there was no sign of Sarah's footprints inside. The farm was never sold. No one ever went near the silo again. I never thought something like this could happen to my family. My daughter Emily was only 8 years old, and she was the light of our lives. She was full of laughter, full of joy, and her curious little mind was always asking questions about the world. My wife and I were proud of how brave she was, how independent. We thought nothing could hurt her, but I was wrong. It all started on a quiet evening. My wife and I had to go out for a couple of hours, so we left Emily home alone for the first time. She was excited about the idea, feeling grown up, and promised us she would be fine. I wasn't worried. Our house was safe, and we weren't going far. Emily was a brave little girl. We came home late, around midnight. The house was dark, quiet. At first, everything seemed normal, but as soon as I stepped inside, I felt something was wrong. A chill ran down my spine, and my heart started to race for no reason. I called out for Emily, but there was no answer. My wife and I rushed upstairs to her room, and that's when we saw her. Emily was lying on the floor next to her bed, completely still. I ran to her side, my hands trembling as I lifted her small body. Her skin was cold to the touch, and for a moment, I thought she was gone. My heart stopped. I shook her gently, calling her name over and over, while my wife, in shock, grabbed the phone to call an ambulance. After what felt like an eternity, Emily stirred. She opened her eyes, but something about her gaze felt off. Her eyes, usually so full of life, looked distant, empty even. She didn't say anything, just looked at me as if she didn't know who I was. Finally, she whispered, "Daddy," but her voice sounded weak, almost like it wasn't her own. We thought she had fainted, maybe from being scared, maybe from being alone for the first time. We took her to the hospital, but after several tests, the doctors said they couldn't find anything wrong with her. They assured us that she was physically fine, but I knew something wasn't right. I could feel it deep inside. The next few days were strange. Emily wasn't herself. She didn't laugh or play the way she used to. She was quiet, distant. She would sit in her room for hours, staring at the wall or out the window, her expression blank. Whenever I tried to talk to her, she would respond with short, empty answers, as if she was lost in her own world. Then the strange things began to happen. At first, it was small things. Lights flickering, doors creaking open by themselves. I brushed it off as coincidences. But then it got worse. At night, I would hear whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. But the whispers grew louder, clearer. They sounded like Emily's voice, but the words were strange, words she would never say. One night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I got up to check on Emily, thinking maybe she was walking in her sleep. When I opened her bedroom door, she was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. "Emily?" I whispered. She didn't respond. She didn't even blink. I walked closer, and then she spoke. But it wasn't her voice. The voice that came from her mouth was deep, cold, and it made my blood run cold. "Daddy," the voice said, "why are you afraid?" I froze. It wasn't Emily. It couldn't be. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and then she laughed. A low, eerie laugh that sent shivers down my spine. I ran out of the room, my mind racing, not knowing what to do. I told my wife about what happened, but she thought it was just a bad dream. She didn't believe me. But I knew what I heard. I knew something was wrong with Emily. The next few nights were terrifying. Emily would talk in her sleep, but it was never her voice. Sometimes I would hear her walking around the house late at night, but when I checked, she would be fast asleep in her bed. The whispers in the house grew louder, more frequent. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then, one night, everything changed. I was sitting in the living room when I heard Emily's voice again, calling me from her room. This time, it sounded like her. But something about it was wrong. Too sweet, too calm. I walked to her room, my hands trembling. As I opened the door, I saw her standing in the middle of the room, facing the window. "Emily?" I called softly. She turned to face me, and I saw her eyes. They weren't her eyes anymore. They were black, hollow, like endless pits of darkness. "Daddy," she said in that same cold voice. "She's gone now. I'm here." Before I could react, Emily collapsed to the floor. I rushed to her side, but this time she didn't wake up. Her body was cold again, and no matter how much I shook her, how much I called her name, she didn't move. The next morning, Emily was gone. She died that night. The doctors said it was sudden, a condition they couldn't explain. But I knew the truth. Something had taken her from us. Something dark. Something evil.
I always thought my son, Jake, was just like any other 11-year-old boy. He was kind, curious, and loved spending time with his friends. But one day, something changed. It started on a normal Tuesday. Jake came home from school, but he wasn't his usual cheerful self. He was quiet, almost too quiet. His backpack seemed heavier than usual, and his clothes were dirty, as if he had been playing in the mud. I asked him what happened at school, but he just shrugged and said, "Nothing, Mom." At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he had a bad day. Kids his age sometimes just don't feel like talking. But over the next few days, I noticed other strange things. He stopped talking about his friends, and when I asked about them, he would avoid eye contact. His once bright smile was now rare. He spent more time alone in his room, and when I asked him what he was doing, he would quickly hide something under his bed. Then, one evening, I was cleaning his room when I found something that didn't belong to him. It was a small toy car, but I knew it wasn't Jake's. I had never seen it before. It was old, scratched, and dirty. I thought maybe he had traded it with a friend, but when I asked him, his reaction was strange. His face turned pale, and he quickly grabbed the car from my hand. "It's mine!" he shouted, his voice trembling. I had never seen him act like this before. "Jake, calm down," I said softly, trying to ease his panic. "If it's yours, then okay, but where did you get it?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me with wide eyes, gripping the toy tightly in his hand. I decided to let it go for the moment, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day, he came home with another strange item. This time, a necklace. I knew for sure it wasn't his. I had seen that necklace before. It belonged to one of his classmates, a girl named Sarah. I had met her mother a few times at school events. "Jake, why do you have this necklace?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "I found it," he mumbled, not looking at me. "Jake, this isn't yours. It belongs to Sarah. You need to give it back." He didn't respond. He just walked to his room and shut the door. I stood there, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. What was happening to my son? As the days passed, more strange things began to happen. I would hear Jake talking to someone in his room, but when I opened the door, he was always alone. He stopped sleeping well, waking up in the middle of the night, screaming from nightmares he couldn't explain. And every time I asked him what was wrong, he would just say, "I'm fine, Mom." But his eyes told a different story. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I stayed up late, listening outside his room. Around midnight, I heard him whispering again. But this time, the voice I heard wasn't his. It was deep, too deep for a child. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly opened the door. Jake was sitting on his bed, his back to me, whispering in a language I didn't recognize. I called his name softly, but he didn't turn around. I stepped closer, and that's when he finally looked at me. His eyes, they weren't his. They were dark, almost black, and filled with something I can only describe as evil. "Jake," I whispered, my voice shaking. He smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was cold, twisted. "He's not here," he said in that strange, deep voice. I froze, unable to move or speak. This wasn't my son. Something was inside him, something dark. Over the next few days, I tried to find help. I went to the school, spoke to his teachers, and even called a doctor. But no one believed me. They said Jake was just going through a phase, that he would grow out of it. But I knew better. The thing inside my son was growing stronger. I could feel its presence in our house, watching, waiting. Then, one night, it happened. I was asleep when I heard a loud crash from Jake's room. I rushed in and found him standing in the middle of the room, his eyes black as coal, holding a mirror that had fallen off the wall. His reflection in the mirror wasn't his own. It was something else, something terrifying. "Mom," he said, his voice cold and empty. "I'm not alone anymore." I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let whatever this was take my son away from me. I spent the next few days researching, trying to find a way to free Jake from this evil. I learned that sometimes spirits or dark entities can attach themselves to children, using them as a vessel to return to the world of the living. I don't know how this thing found Jake, but I knew I had to fight it. I won't stop until I get my son back, even if it means facing the darkest of forces. Jake, my sweet boy, wherever you are, I will find you.
We were never a family of means, so when Dad said we were going on a short vacation, I was surprised. A break was something we desperately needed, though, after months of scraping by. He found a deal online for a stay at an old motel on the outskirts of our town, the Willow Creek Inn. It promised peace and solitude, and for a price that didn't make Mom wince, it seemed perfect. The motel was a relic from another era, the kind you'd see in old road trip movies, with its neon sign flickering in a half-hearted attempt to welcome us. We checked into our room, which had 2 beds with musty quilts and a view of the deserted parking lot. The air was stale, and the carpet was speckled with stains of dubious origins. "It's just for a few nights," Mom reminded us, forcing a smile. The first night passed uneventfully, or so we thought. On the second night, things began to change. It started with my little brother, Jamie, who woke us all up around midnight, crying. He said he saw a shadow moving across the room, one that whispered his name. We thought it was just a nightmare, so Mom took him back to bed while I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the building settling. By the third night, I could no longer deny that something was off. I heard the whispers too, soft and sibilant, slipping through the cracks in the walls. They seemed to beckon me, calling me by name, urging me to join them. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to shut them out, but they only grew louder. Determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head, I got out of bed to investigate. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been with the heater running. As I stepped closer to where Jamie had seen the shadow, the temperature dropped further, and I saw my breath fog up in the air. Then, I heard it. A child's laughter, echoing down the hallway outside our room. I crept to the door and peered out. The hallway was empty, but the laughter continued, bouncing off the walls, playful yet chilling. I followed the sound to the end of the corridor, where it led to a locked door marked storage. The laughter stopped abruptly as I approached, replaced by a low, mournful sobbing. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating as the cold metal seemed to burn against my skin. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate. With a deep breath, I turned the knob, but the door wouldn't budge. I returned to our room, unsettled and unsure. The next morning, I asked the motel owner about the storage room. He looked confused, then concerned. "We don't use that part of the building," he said slowly. "It's been sealed off for years after a fire. No one goes there." That night, the whispers returned with a vengeance. They were no longer just whispers, but cries. Pleas for help, for release. Jamie refused to sleep, and Mom admitted she'd heard them too. We decided to leave first thing in the morning. As dawn broke, we packed our things, the motel seemingly impatient to see us gone. The air felt heavier, the whispers now silent, as if holding their breath. We drove away, the Willow Creek Inn disappearing behind us. But the echoes of those forgotten voices lingered long after we had gone, a haunting reminder of the unseen and unheard. Life in Fisher's Cove had always been deeply intertwined with the capricious whims of the sea. As a fisherman whose lineage was as salt-soaked as the wood of the village pier, I understood the sea's moods intimately, its sudden storms, its deceptive calms. But nothing in my years steering through its swells could have prepared me for the ghostly fog that enveloped our village one foreboding autumn evening. The day had been ordinary, marked by the usual chorus of gulls and the rhythmic clanking of boat masts. My wife, Elsie, a woman whose roots were in the bustling city, had adapted to the isolation of Fisher's Cove because of its picturesque charm and the tales of old that I'd weave for her under the starlit sky. Our twin sons, Jack and Oliver, energetic and ever-curious 8-year-olds, spent their afternoons darting around the rocky shore, their pockets perpetually filled with shells and smooth pebbles. That evening, as a thick, icy fog began to roll in from the horizon, I felt a chill that went deeper than the bone. It was a forewarning, a silent alarm that rang through my body. I gathered the boys, their cheeks flushed with the cold, and cautioned them with a sternness born of fear. The sea was a living thing, and like all living things, it could be unpredictable, malevolent. I saw in their bright eyes that same reckless spark that had led me to the sea's treacherous embrace so many times. Nightfall did not bring clarity, but rather swallowed the village in an impenetrable, suffocating shroud. From our modest kitchen, where Elsie hummed as she stirred a pot of stew, the world outside was obliterated. It was as if our home were adrift in an endless gray sea. When the boys did not respond to Elsie's call to dinner, panic clawed at my throat. Lantern in hand, I plunged into the fog, my shouts for Jack and Oliver swallowed by the thick air. The path to the beach, so familiar by daylight, now seemed alien and treacherous. My lantern's feeble light only caught brief glimpses of the wet sand and seaweed-strewn rocks. No sign of my sons. The night stretched on, each minute an eternity tinged with dread. My search grew more frantic, my calls more desperate. Only when the first faint light of dawn began to dispel the fog did the sea yield its heart-shattering secret. Not just my sons, but Elsie too, driven by her own terror and love to find our boys, lay upon the cold sand, their bodies still and pale as driftwood. In trying to bring them home, she too had been claimed by the merciless tide. The village of Fisher's Cove, once a vibrant tapestry of life and laughter, turned into a hollow echo of its former self. Our home became a mausoleum of memories, each corner haunted by the ghosts of what had been. The community mourned, their somber faces etched with a grief that mirrored my own desolation. Now, I find myself drawn to the shore each evening, as if the sea that robbed me of everything still holds some fragment of my heart. The fog rolls in and out, a spectral dance between the living and the lost. I hear their voices in the crash of the waves, feel their presence in the caress of the cold wind. They beckon me to join them, and on nights when the moon casts a silver path across the water, I am almost tempted to heed their call. The sea is a cruel mistress, and I am the keeper of its darkest secrets and lost souls. Fisher's Cove may never recover from its loss, and neither may I. But still, the sea calls, and still, I listen.